All right, be on your most articulate best behavior. What we're going to do now is talk about, let me share my screen with you. So this is assignment 2. And as you've already seen, probably assignment 2 goes from the 1910s to the 1940s. And like the other one, I broke it up into 3 parts, just hopefully it's more bite-sized and digestible. Part 1, we're going to be talking about the progressive movements in World War I. Part 2, we're going to talk about early 20th century civil rights movements, the backlash against them, and the Great Depression. And then part 3, the New Deal's efforts to bring us out of the Great Depression and World War II. Heavy, big, huge subjects. Again, you can take the whole, if you go on to upper division schooling and take history classes or go to graduate school, you can take a whole class on the Great Depression, right? A whole 15-week class or a whole 15-week class on World War II. So believe me, I'm just skimming the surface and just covering what I think is important, okay? And make sure you complement what we're doing, what we're chatting about here in lecture with the textbook and other things. Remember, use various resources. The first due date is in 1 week, right? September 27th at midnight. And again, due dates are big recommendations for me. If you get it in a couple days late, just because you really want to expand on it more, that's totally fine. I will, you have earned all your grace. I think we all have this time in. So assignment 1, I'm going to scroll down just to show you what we're doing today. This is what we did last week, the progressive movements. This is a film you all are going to watch. This is a very powerful film, very well done. And it talks about this tragedy that happened in New York, in New York City. And then the fallout of the tragedy was that a lot of progressive reforms in New York City and elsewhere took place. For example, you see the fire escape? That was not existent during this deadly factory accident in New York City, which killed, I think, over 100, mostly young women. So watch this powerful film. And if you have trouble accessing it, let me know. It's on the Shasta College free streaming website. Scrolling down. So today we're going to talk about the Great War, AKA World War I. And please interrupt me, and I'll be calling on you. I get so bored of hearing myself talk. So I will be talking about these questions right here. And then after this recording has been processed by the computer whizzes, I will post it right here. So any questions about that? Any questions about that, or do you just want to roll with my short interpretation of World War I? Okay, so what do you all bring to the table about World War I? I'm just curious. This is legit my curiosity. What do you know about it? Any
trenches,
little stories? Go ahead, Joey.
Trenches, a war that didn't really have much of a purpose. It kind of should have been between, I want to say it's Austria, and I don't remember what the other country is, but everyone got looped into it because of the Ally system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was.
And then Germany lost, and that's why we had World War II, because they had to rebuild economically, and they decided to be Nazis to do that, essentially, is my knowledge of it.
Oh, I like it. There you go. There's the Wikipedia first sentence about World War II, World War I. I like it. Yeah, this complex web of alliances was unraveled quickly. And you had these industrial giants fighting each other. And even Bob Dylan has a song that goes something like, I don't even know what World War I was all about. Right on, Joey. Rachel, do you bring anything to the table?
I'm familiar with a song that I've heard that goes, "We're here because we're here because we're here because we're here." And I believe the British sang it. I'm familiar with that in trench warfare. And 1917 is one of my favorite movies right now, so.
Yes, that song captures the absurdity of it, right? We're here because we're here because we're here. And also 1917, if y'all haven't seen that film, I don't know if you have to pay for it to watch it, but it's a very powerful docudrama. It's a brilliant film. It's called 1917. I'll just put the numbers here in case that's helpful, huh? And then from Chatville, if you all can see your chat, check it out. Ari responded to the first big conflict between nations. World War I is really the first time ammunition is used en masse. And that's the key part of her sentence, en masse. So we will talk about that. I'm not going to be able to cover all of World War I in the time we have because I want to respect your time till 1:30. So I'll be recording the second part of this lecture, which talks about the cultural fallout after World War I, how it even influenced art, right? Cubism rose after World War I, this kind of jazz music that sounds kind of like, right? Get rid of all the traditional norms. So as you all know, Dadaism, right? Joey, Dadaism, all this just exploding this romantic notion of Western progress. That's what World War I did at its core, I think. So we'll talk about the cultural fallout in lecture 2, at which I'll post and I'll record later today. All right, let's go. It was called at the time the Great War because, of course, they didn't know there would be a World War II. And this is a powerful photo of some trench, these are British soldiers in the trenches. And there's many tragic stories about World War I, but there's also stories of camaraderie. This fellow on the left, he was 2 days away from his time up and he was going to be able to go back home. He wrote prolific diaries about his time in the trenches and in World War I. He talked about everything like the food and the rats and the camaraderie. It's a very well, and if you want to know more about it, let me know. It's a powerful, powerful set of diaries. But he died later on this day after this photograph was taken. So he was one of hundreds of thousands who did not survive World War I. Why did it happen? Oh my gosh, please consult the book and a lot of material out there. But in a nutshell, and this is my interpretation of it, right? I'm just a Latin American US historian trying to interpret European history. So there were a set of old empires. And when I say old, the Ottoman Empire had been around for 400 years. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had been around a while. Britain had been around at least since the 1600s as a powerful force. France and Russia. So historians call these kind of the old empires who had dominated this part of the world, Western Europe and other places, which I'll get to in a second. These old empires are weakening. And there's some rising new powers on the scene come the late 1800s. Germany is a rising political, economic, and military power. They had only recently become a nation. Germany was only invented in the 1870s, yet they are rising quickly. The United States, as you saw in the last assignment, had just consolidated control of North America, by the 1870s, and by the 1890s, we saw last time they expanded abroad. The United States won its first colonies, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Philippines, just recently. And Japan, way over here on the right side of the screen. Japan was a rising industrial and colonial strength in its own right, okay? What strikes you about these three countries? What are they going to be doing to each other?
They're the major forces of World War II.
Exactly, right? Exactly. World War II, bang, these are the major forces. Well said. One of the many things that these empires and countries are conflicting over and fighting over is control of colonial possessions around the world, right? We saw this briefly when we spoke about the rise of US empire. But Western European countries and Japan are vying for colonial influence in Southeast Asia, over here, in Africa, big time, and in the Caribbean, right? So there's literal growing conflicts throughout the world with regards to who's going to own these colonies. Another data point to think about when you're thinking about, geez, what happened to Europe? I thought it was supposed to be this, the beacon of civilization in the West. There were growing nationalisms. And when I say nationalisms, for example, ethno-linguistic Czech speakers here and Slovak-speaking peoples started to think back, we want our own nation. We don't want to be ruled by this big, huge Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is right about here. We want our own nation, right? Poland wanted to be its own nation, right? The Dutch, etc. So this growing nationalism throughout the Western world also fed into desire to break away from empires and have their own nationalisms.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, ma'am, you better. I don't want to.
Well, so in today's sort of political sphere, when I hear the word nationalism, the thing I associate with it is like intense racism.
Against who?
What? Oh, against who? Well, it's a word neo-Nazis use it to disguise the fact that they're neo-Nazis. They call themselves white nationalism and they just hate everyone else. So
yeah, that's what I want to emphasize. Everyone else. There's a anti-other attitude, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
So, but it seems like in this context, it doesn't necessarily have that idea because they're getting out empires, right? They're not like expelling minorities, they're expelling their conquerors. So it's sort of different. Am I correct in that thinking?
In a way, yes. They didn't want their empirical overlords, for lack of a better term, but the Hungarians here were, Hungarians, also known as Magyars here, were extremely anti-Slovak, were extremely anti-Romanian. Not all of them, mind you, right? Not all of them, just a very vocal and militaristic minority. Right? Serbians wanted their own state and didn't like Croatians. So this was also a time of people moving, physical, war refugees moving to where other like-minded and other folks speaking the same language lived. Okay, because this is, Austro-Hungarian Empire, for example, is a very ethnically and religiously diverse place. Unfortunately, World War I and then World War II caused folks to, we had the Holocaust and the genocide of Jews and gays and Roma people. It really, and I'll continue this with World War II. So you're right, there was an especially high feeling of we don't like the other. Is that a long-winded, lame explanation, Joey?
I think so. I guess I was trying to determine whether, I don't know, I guess I was trying to think of, in the modern day, if somebody calls themselves a nationalist, I assume that they're a terrible person, and I'm trying to, I guess that you can't really apply morality to history in this way, but I was trying to.
In the case of the modern
look at how they applied morality. We can look at how people at the time applied what they thought about themselves and what they thought about other people. So you know what? Hopefully I can answer the question as we go along. Because I'm going to talk about how Germans in the United States lost their quote unquote white privilege, okay, during World War I. So that'll be me doing my job and answering the question through historical example. All right, let's do it. So can you all see the image fine? Is that big enough for you? Okay. So in the 1890s, many people, whether they're politicians or artists or other folks paying attention, were really worried about like the end of the world. Plus folks who pay attention to numbers, whoa, it's the 1890s, pretty soon it's going to be 1900. And throughout Western history, whenever, right, every 100 years, oftentimes people think, wow, the end of the world's going to come. I don't know if y'all remember in the year 1999, many people were scared that Y2K was going to kind of ruin everything and the computers are going to turn all our bank accounts like into zip. And so every 100 years in the Western world, some people go through a freak out. So there was that element, but there was also a boom in apocalyptic science fiction. And science fiction was mostly expressed through this new medium of the comic book. And look at this science fiction magazine from the late 1900s. It's called Aftermath by Brian Barry. And it's like this apocalyptic world where the city's destroyed, right? And there's rocket ships going up. Many folks were predicting total war. For example, this guy, Alfred Nobel. You heard of Alfred Nobel, right? The Swedish guy, right? He was a chemist. And he figured out how to take very volatile, what's the chemical? Nitroglycerin, and how to put some clay on it so it wasn't as volatile, and he created, boom, dynamite. So he created dynamite largely in his idea was to use it for infrastructure building, blowing holes in tunnels for trains, for mining. But what did dynamite end up being used for very, very often?
Warfare?
Huh?
Warfare, I assume?
Yeah, blowing people up. And Alfred Nobel said, no, 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 I don't want to blow people up. So he invested a bunch of money in this Nobel Peace Prize named after him. And he got together a group of folks and said, you know what, I created dynamite. Oh my gosh, it's helping to destroy many people. I want to somehow, right the ship. So he created the Nobel Peace Prize, which is still a prize handed out every year today. In an attempt.
Kind of a funny origin story.
I'm sorry?
I just think it's kind of funny that the Nobel Peace Prize was created because a guy essentially screwed up and created violence. So now to try and convince people not to do the thing he made them do, he's handing out prizes for peace.
Unintended consequences. How often has some invention been created for one purpose and then us humans repurpose it, right? There's so many examples of this. Yep. You can say the same for Oppenheimer, who helped build the nuclear bomb. Later on, he turned pacifist and said, oh my gosh, I wish I wouldn't help build the nuclear bomb. Click, click. So another reason why World War I happened, the new power Japan fought a war with Russia over control of Manchuria, this mainland part of eastern Russia. And you know who ended up winning the war? This up and coming, relatively small island nation. Japan defeated Russia. The reason why I'm bringing it up here is not just to show you these cool, I'm into political cartoons, right? Here's smaller Japan, right? Kind of a racist depiction of Japanese, punching in the head a big old Rasputin looking Russian. The reason I bring this up is because in an attempt to quell increasing world tensions, right? There's tensions and minor conflicts that are going to turn into World War I the world over. President Roosevelt stepped in and helped Russians and Japanese negotiate a peace, and he was one of the first winners of the Nobel Peace Prize. President Roosevelt, just to complicate his figure even more, I know we've been looking at various aspects of Roosevelt, the trust buster, Roosevelt, the imperialist, and here is Roosevelt, the peacemaker. Please stop me anytime. Again, the thing you might know about what started World War I, and I'm just going to do it in a couple different slides just because you get this all the time. The 400-year-old, very ethnically and religiously diverse Ottoman Empire, this area, orange area here, is breaking up. All these different folks want their own country, as I said. So what happened in the summer of 14, this Serbian nationalist, self-described anarchist, killed the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. And while this might not have, right, there was many political assassinations at this time. President McKinley was assassinated about 10 years before in the United States. While this might not have done much, globally, it was in this context of world powers with very tense relations with one another. So as Joey said from the outset, what this led to was that, here's the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Germany promised to support Austria and Hungary. Russia promised to support Serbia in these disjointed series of alliances. And when Germany invaded Belgium, France and the United Kingdom had these treaties to protect Belgium, and things just exploded. Before you know it, you had the yellows versus the pinks, right? Big yellows. The yellows are called the Allies, and the pinks call themselves the Axis powers. And again, your book gets into this in much greater detail, and I just want to point this out to you. But because I'm a cultural historian at heart, I always like to see how different countries, try to persuade their population, their citizenry, to put their lives on the line, right? This is a British enlistment poster. how are they depicting the German invasion of Belgium? And how are they, what's the message here in this British enlistment poster, yo?
It's, well, the Germans are burning Belgium, and it's remember Belgium, it's think about the Belgian people. In another way, it's kind of like the literal land is being destroyed. There's like fire in the background. So remember what Belgium what used to look like? Now it looks like this.
Yeah, and who are the victims here?
Belgian people?
Especially what kind of Belgian people?
Oh, there's women and children. I see.
Yeah, women and children, right? Here's one that's taken it a step further. This is a French Canadian. Wait, I think we have. This is a French Canadian recruitment poster. And look at here. Look at this very, right, dehumanized German soldier totally just stepping on this Belgian woman. Right, again, bad German beasts, right, killing Belgian women and children. So who should the US support? Many in the United States did not want to get entangled in this European conflict. They said, no, that's why we left Europe, so they can deal with their own business. We do not want to get entangled in this. However, in 1915, Germans sunk the Lusitania. You might have heard this one. This is like the top 10 what you know about World War I things. Does anybody know why the Germans sank the Lusitania? Ari, if you can, you feel free, Ari, to chat away too. I'm checking out the chats. There's the chats. Well,
wasn't the U.S. supporting? Was the U.S. supporting Britain, like sending supplies to Britain?
Yeah, the US wasn't officially supporting the Allies, Britain and France and Russia, but we were sending our companies, munitions companies, were selling them arms. And how did we get those arms over there? We used ships like the Lusitania. So there'd be the tourists or the travelers, right? Mostly travelers, people going from Europe to the United States. And down below in the cargo holds would be crates of munitions. So on one hand, there's munitions underneath and people traveling, everyday civilians on top. So check this out. I know you can't read this, but this notice here in this New York newspaper is from the German Imperial Embassy. And it says, hey, travelers, if you go on the Lusitania, you might be sunk because the Lusitania is containing arms that are meant to blow up Germans. We don't want that to happen. So we might blow up the Lusitania. So isn't that crazy? So right next to where you can call and get your ticket to Europe via Liverpool is a notice that you may die. Isn't that crazy? Crazy ad. So the Germans were warning Americans. So when Germany sunk the Lusitania, some Americans said, hey, we got to go. We got to hit it. We got to hit Germany. However, in the presidential election of 1916, President Wilson, who had already been president, he was running for his second term, President Wilson and candidate Wilson at that time argued, quote, we have to be neutral since otherwise our mixed population would wage war on each other. What does he mean by that? We have to stay out of World War I, otherwise our mixed population would wage war on each other. What's Wilson getting at?
We have immigrants from all around the world and particularly Europe. So if, we have German Americans and British Americans, we don't want them to take sides within the country itself. We don't want like a revolt of British citizens because we reported Germany or vice versa.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And the largest ethnic minority in the United States at the time were Germans. Right, see all the blue? I don't know if you can see it. The blue are counties in which German Americans were the largest population. And this is what he said. This was Wilson's rhetoric that we're going to have Germans fighting Irish, fighting British in the streets, fighting French in the streets. Most political thinkers and historians said, no, people identified as Americans, right? They're not going to go and roll down the street and like just rough up the local German. However, this was the argument, right, he made. Many were against the war. Not all German Americans were against the war, mind you, but many German Americans were against the war. Many Irish Americans were against the war because they complained, their complaints were that, wait a minute, we left Ireland because British colonizers came here in the 1600s and have been depriving us Irish folks since then. So we don't want to go fight on the side of the British. So many Irish Americans said, stay out of the war. Many pacifists, just because pacifist means they're against all war, Quakers and others didn't want to go to war. And many Americans who just saw World War I as just another empire fighting another empire for the spoils of colonies. They didn't want to go to war. And here's a, can you see this poster? What strikes you about this poster here? This is a poster of one of the hit songs of the day. I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier. What do you think is significant about this empty frame? What do you think, Rachel?
I'm wondering, is that like a picture frame where perhaps like future generations might be the mom hugging the son there?
Yeah, and then he's going to go and die, and you're right. There won't be any future there won't be any future. Yep, good point. Nevertheless, many Americans also wanted us to get in. You know how America's a little conflicted today, right? Isn't there some conflict in America right now? Oh my gosh, nothing new, maybe not to the heights we're seeing right now, but Herbert Hoover was a mining industrialist who was living in London at the time. He's going to be a future president of the United States, but before he was president, he was a very successful miner, and he owned a fleet of boats, ships to help get his iron ore and stuff back and forth across the Atlantic. He was in the largest philanthropical episode's the wrong word. He got together 5.5 million tons of food and supplies from all kinds of Americans and British folks and all kinds of donors. And he sent them to Belgium, right? This is a total not related to the government effort. So it's a pretty cool piece of humanitarian philanthropy that Herbert Hoover embarked upon, and it made him become very famous and was one of the things to help him get elected in the future when he becomes president. However, many Americans questioned the fact that we were neutral. Look at this. Here's what historians show you, right? Boring charts. Here's a boring but telling chart. So this chart and these series of lines shows you the US exports to Central and Allied powers. The Allied powers, which is the green line, they're like Britain, United Kingdom, France, and Russia. Mostly the United Kingdom and France. And then it also shows you US exports, largely munitions, arms, to the Central Axis powers, Germany and Austro-Hungary. Who are we selling more arms to by far? By far, by far.
The Allied powers. But I was going to ask, is that a significant change from before the war? Because I mean, pretty much for all of our history, our major trade partner has been Britain. So
Yep, you're right. Well, and that didn't start till 1820 that we had that whole revolution thing, and they were kind of pissed off. Yeah. But you're exactly right. Our number one trading partner throughout the 1900s was Britain. I don't know about number one. I'll have to see about that. But a major trading partner was Britain. So yes, this is a continuation of our allegiance to and alliance with our former mother country, Britain. So many Americans were saying, wait a minute, we aren't neutral. We're selling way more arms to Britain and France. And while we're at it, we are not neutral because US arm manufacturers are making huge profits selling war munitions to Germany, especially Britain and France, and they're blowing up Germans and everybody else. This is just an excuse to show this image. Isn't that a crazy image? Can you imagine somebody as klutzy as me walking through there? Oh man, it wouldn't be good. It would not be good.
what are those?
Those are missiles. Missiles,
Okay.
missiles. Oh my God. Look at women in the workforce. Right. Okay. This is another question I ask you about World War I. I ask you, how did it provide women more opportunities? Well, since many men, millions of men were enlisted, lucrative, well-paying jobs became open to women and to African Americans and Mexican Americans for the first time. So here are women working in the munitions factories. Okay. Isn't that a crazy picture? So this false neutrality that many Americans argued was hypocritical. William Jennings Bryant, that fellow who ran for president about 4 or 5 times but never won, he quit. He was the Secretary of State at the time. He quit and called our so-called neutrality hypocritical. Right? So many Americans, once again, were questioning, right, which side do we go? Do we stay neutral? One of the other final data points as to why the US entered the war, which is the #1 question you'll be answering on assignment 2, question 1, has to do with Mexico. In the 1910s, Mexicans were going through a big revolution. It lasted from 1910 to 1920. There were many different forces at work within Mexico, vying for power after this long dictatorship had ruled Mexico. So one of the major forces in the north, anybody recognize this man on a horse in the upper left? I know it might be kind of small on your screens. Anybody recognize this guy in the upper left? No? His name is Pancho Villa. Does that ring a bell? Pancho Villa? Oh, take my Mexican American history class next semester. I'm offering it online. You'll learn a lot about Pancho Villa. He was a wealthy northern Mexican rancher, and he was upset that the United States, for various reasons. So Pancho Villa ended up invading a small town named Columbus, New Mexico, taking it for a few days and then retreating. This really upset the United States for obvious reasons. So the United States sent this huge military force into the mountains of Mexico to look for him, and they never found him. And this just led to heightened tensions. So what does this have to do with World War I? Well, there was a telegram that was intercepted from Germany to the head of Mexico, one of the heads of Mexico. Remember, this was a time of revolution. That Germany said, hey, Mexico, if you invade the United States from the south, right, and if we win, if Germany wins with Mexico's help, Germany will give back the lands that Mexico lost during the Mexican-American War. Isn't that crazy? So California would still be Mexico if Germany won World War I. Who knows, right? This is one of those counterfactuals. But whether or not this was a serious promise by German leadership, we don't know. But what we do know is the press picked it up, and the United States and many Americans were freaked out by it. Right? The press at the time made a big deal about it, like certain elements of the media tend to do. And in fact, go ahead.
I've asked a million questions and I'm so sorry.
I love a million questions.
The promise of Germany giving Mexico, the Southwest, what possible power could they have had to do that? Even if they had won the war, are they gonna take over the United States? Like, how would that have happened?
That's why most historians don't take it too seriously.
Okay.
What they do take seriously is Americans freaking out.
Okay, that makes sense.
About this, right? It's not a serious thing. It's a silly promise. Not a silly promise, but a scary promise for many Americans. And this is just an excuse to show you this very detailed painting of a German U-boat sinking yet another American ship. So what happened after the sinking of the Lusitania was that Germany and the United States made a deal. The United States said, hey, Germany, stop sinking our ships and we won't enter the war. Germany said, okay, but then they continued sinking the ships. So in April of 1917, and this is the important part that'll link to the next few lectures I'm going to talk about, okay? This is going to be very important, so pay attention to this. In April 1917, President Wilson appeals to Congress to enter the war. Because according to US law, who declares war? Which branch of government declares war? Is it the Supreme Court?
Congress.
Congress. Congress is the, and you know the last time we were at war? World War II. That was the last time. Uh-oh, chat. You're like, Rodriguez, I know we were like Vietnam and Korea and Afghanistan. Those were never declared by Congress wars. Isn't that weird? Legal fictions. We'll get into that later. So here's, this is the important part. President Wilson argued to Congress and the American people. He said, we are going to war because our object is to vindicate the principles of peace and justice in the life of the world as against selfish and autocratic power. We are glad to fight for the ultimate peace of the world and for the liberation of its peoples, the German peoples included, for the right of nations great and small and the privilege of men everywhere to choose their way of life. The world must be made safe for democracy. Whoa, what's Wilson saying there? Rachel or Joey or Ari? Ari, I can read your text, so all your chats. What's Wilson saying? Why are we getting into the war?
To protect from dictatorship, essentially.
Yep, we're having a coming out party like, hey, we're America and we're going to protect the whole world from
violence with our violence.
Queen. Yeah, sorry, Joey?
We're protecting the world from violence with our violence.
Yeah, there's that. But this was supposed to be the war to end all wars. And we're going to make the world safe for democracy, okay? You know who heard this? It wasn't just Americans thinking about US entering World War I, right? Oh, here he is talking. Many women we didn't allow y'all to vote in 1917. Sorry, Joey and Rachel and Ari. So many women were like, wait a minute, we're going to go sacrifice our young boys in Europe in the name of democracy, yet I can't vote here. Does that make sense? So you know what this did? This really put the women's suffrage movement over the top, right? Within 2 years of us entering the war, the constitutional amendment, the 19th Amendment passed and women could vote. So if we're going to say something, we're going to make the world safe for democracy, many Americans are going to go like, let's start at home, okay? This is when Native Americans earned their citizenship. They said, wait a minute, aren't I a citizen? Shouldn't I be able to vote? Boom, a couple years after this, Native Americans gained the right to vote. Black Americans who experienced the worst part of American apartheid, and apartheid means living apart, apartheid. So many African Americans and Mexican Americans in the Southwest said, wait a minute, we're gonna fight to make the world safe for democracy. Why don't we start here? Okay, and this is going to really catapult the civil rights movement in the 19 teens, and that'll be a subject of 2 lectures from now. Many people in Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Hawaii, which were colonies of the United States and who could not vote, Puerto Ricans, by the way, still cannot vote, said, wait a minute, if we're going to make the world safe for democracy, why don't we start in our colonies, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Hawaii? And the final data point with, and my larger point is, how did this speech inspire many Americans to fight for more civil rights here at home? Many Filipinos heard this. Remember, the Philippines was a US territory or colony from, much of the early 1900s. Many Filipinos said, wait a minute, why don't we get citizenship rights? Any questions about that? Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. Let's see, it's 1:15. We got a couple more. Oh yeah, we're on our home stretch. So Americans, can you see my screen? You can't, huh? No, share. So this iconic poster in which Uncle Sam is rudely pointing at you, right? We don't do that anymore, huh? We don't. Do I ever point at you students like that? Hey, you, answer the question. So in 1917, the United States Office of War Propaganda, that's the name of the department, really started to recruit Americans in order to persuade them to fight the war. Have y'all seen this one, this image of Uncle Sam? Joey and Rachel and Ari?
Weren't
Right?
they drafting at this point though? Why did they need propaganda? I thought that they were essentially just
Well, again, many Americans were still on the fence.
okay.
Right? So there were various ways. Yeah, this was the first peacetime draft. I was going to skip it because too much stuff, but this was the first draft, or they called it selective service to make you feel a little more special, like they're going to select you for service.
Mhm.
Yeah, this is the first selective service in peacetime. During the US Civil War, there was a draft, but that was after the war had already begun. So we had not entered the war, but we're already selecting young American men to join. All right, here's a little bit of the cultural history. You know who we borrowed from creating this US Army recruiting poster? Here he is. Here's the symbol of Britain. Here's the British recruiting poster. Who's absent? Is it you? So they're guilt tripping, right? Men voting. Admit. Oh, good. Matthew's back. And again, I'm recording this so you can come and look at it. And plus, many of your fellow students don't have the time right now or the connectivity to watch this lecture right now. All right, one last poster. Joey, Rachel, Ari, or Matthew, how are they enticing young American men to join the service with this one? It says, gee, I wish I were a man. I'd join the Navy. Be a man and do it.
They're like emasculating them.
Exactly.
Well, sorry, never mind.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Joey.
I imagine that was probably true of how a lot of women at that time felt. I mean, we were still having debates about women in the military relatively recently. So, I mean, there probably was a fair amount of women who would have joined the Navy if they could have.
You're right. You're exactly. I'm just responding to Ari over there. She said, yep, shaming guys by calling them women for not joining the war. That's the right term, emasculating them, right? Emasculate. And you are exactly right. Okay. You're going to see the same thing in World War II posters. I'll show a lot of them. So, whoa, look at this Army enlistment poster. And the gorilla, right, this dehumanized form is Germany. And the gorilla's hat has the word militarism on it. And he has the spiky little Prussian helmet thing. And Germany's going to bash us over the head in a very bloody way. Can you see the word on the baseball bat? It says culture. Germans are going to bash us with their culture. In fact, much of the culture that many Americans embraced were Wagner, its music, writings of Goethe, and there were many. I think the most Nobel Prizes won for science at this time were by German scientists. German scientists were inventing all kinds of things from like cocaine and better ways to mine. I'm not joking about that either. So 25% of the US population were either first or second generation German. I count my great-grandfather Hans Wehinger was one of these 25%. One of my grandfather's lineages was from Germany. And this is a time many historians argue that Germans for a short period of time lost their white privilege. What do I mean by that? Is that in many places, Beethoven and Goethe, it's a very famous German poet, were banned. They were not allowed to be taught in various schools and other places. Many places banned the speaking of the German language. And you might think, man, nobody's speaking German. Well, many places were. These are first and second generation migrants. And still in communities throughout the United States, German was just a common language to be heard throughout, right? Pubs or farms and elsewhere. Excuse me. Many municipalities and other places, and even at the state level, started to change names of things. And this is kind of like, oh, wow, that's kind of cutesy, Rodriguez. Joey's writing, it's the equivalent of banning Spanish in today's culture, kinda. Yeah, kinda. I like the kinda word. Hamburgers, we stopped calling them hamburgers. Hamburger is a German name. Became Salisbury steaks. Sauerkraut, we renamed it as Liberty cabbage. There it is. Bratwurst now became hot dogs. And the German Shepherd became the Alsatian. I'm sorry, Alsatian. Is that how you pronounce that word? Alsatian, you dog people? Alsatian? Yeah? Okay. Isn't that crazy? And there was a lot of this propaganda. Here's a rather comical piece of propaganda talking about, okay. Here's another piece of political propaganda talking about more German atrocities. Do y'all like Limburger cheese? Yeah? Oh my gosh, I wish I did. It's a potent cheese.
It looks like it's making fun of the other propaganda. Like that doesn't look like it's intended to be taken seriously.
No, but this was a serious.
Okay.
But you're right. There's a comedic element to it, isn't there? Right. But there's not much comedy about this. You know who it also targeted in the United States? Dachshunds or wiener dogs. I am not joking. Look at this propaganda poster in which this little kid with a gun, its shadow is like an American revolutionary hero, right? That's like George Washington. And they're going to shoot the German dachshund. Right? Isn't that crazy? I like dogs, but not this breed. It is sad. And you know what happened? It wasn't just propaganda against the dogs. Look what happened in Cincinnati. Thousands of dachshunds were killed throughout the United States. Right, this one. The United States Marine Corps poster was responsible for the German doggie's social demise. The poster depicts an American bulldog chasing a German dachshund in the words, "devil dogs." So this report comes from near Cincinnati, Ohio, and it's basically many Americans unleashed their dogs, their bulldog terriers against these wiener dogs, and thousands were killed throughout the United States. Isn't that crazy to think about? Right? Please don't believe me. Check it out. Exit the German dachshund. And finally, for this part, closer to home, German place names were changed throughout the United States. For example, Germantown down here in Glenn County. Have any of you gone down I-5 and you see the little sign for Artois? Artois or Artois? That used to be called Germantown. Residents of Germantown, Glenn County, are circulating a petition to change the name of the town to Artois. The agitation to change the name was hastened by the action of a trainload of selective servicemen en route to Camp Lewis, who attempted to down the sign Germantown from the station building. Crazy, right? How history happened. So that is it for this first half of World War I lecture. Next time, we're going to go more into how it impacted people in the United States. For example, talking about who the average recruit was in the United States, right? It was a young man in his mid-20s, white, single, little formal education, right? We'll talk about that. Okay. Questions or comments about, and I'm happy to stay on with y'all, but questions or comments about this lecture? I'm gonna